We're going to look at 2 Timothy, which is the book before Titus and before Hebrews, right at the end of the Pauline epistles.
Now we are dealing with 2 Timothy, a letter written by Paul, at least. This is what is said at the beginning. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, for the sake of the promise of life that is in Jesus Christ, to Timothy, my beloved child.
Timothy was a very, very close friend and convert of Paul's. Clearly, Timothy was converted or came to faith during the first missionary journey, because he came from Lystra, which was Paul's first missionary journey.
So he was born from a Jewish mother and had a Greek father. So when Paul came into his hometown in Asia Minor, he circumcised him, took him with him as a young travel companion, as a fellow missionary and fellow apostle.
I mean, the fact that Paul gave Timothy so many strategic tasks to do, I mean, sometimes Paul was in prison or prevented from doing something, and very often when Paul couldn't come himself, he sent Timothy to speak on his behalf.
It's very short. It's full of pastoral mentions, as it were, of his friends and his associates, people that he thinks people should stay away from. He talks about a coppersmith that people should stay away from. There's lots of personal stuff that, in a way, seems amazing, hasn't come into the New Testament at all. So he says, when you come, can you bring that cloak that I left behind? Can you bring the books for me? Can you bring the manuscripts? In fact, he says, most importantly, can you bring me my manuscripts?
The purpose of his letter is to say to Timothy, you've really been a minister on my behalf. Now rekindle the gift that was given to you. And one of the interesting things today is, he says, the gift given to you through the laying on of hands. So, of course, at every ordination and confirmation, hands are laid on someone by the bishop. And there is biblical warrant for how important, as a sign of blessing and commission, the laying on of hands was.
It's all quite personal, and he also talks about his imminent death in quite a moving way.
And 2 Timothy is, in a way, presents itself as a kind of testament of Paul to his successor, to one of his beloved co-workers. It's 4 chapters, and if it's from Paul, then of course it's the last letter written by Paul. Again, a situation that he's in prison, that he expects his death. But it's not a triumphant Paul. It's Paul in distress, Paul being alone.
And so Paul is really encouraging Timothy to carry on the good work, and more so. And I think it's quite typical of a man nearing the end of his life to say, well, I'm passing the torch on to you. It's in your hands now to carry on with my work.
So part of these letters are quite moving, because it shows Paul in distress, and he was deserted by some of his fellow apostles. Obviously, some were not so happy with his thrive and eagerness and zeal for the gospel, which might have created occasionally troubles. So he wrote in this letter at the end, "Do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessaloniki. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me." So this idea that Paul is alone, only Luke is with him, and that he tries to get Timothy at his side. I think it's at least the letter creates this idea that Paul is on one hand lonely, but on the other hand there's a kind of triumphant element in it, when he makes clear, okay, I have finished my race. And Paul actually uses in this letter the image of a foot race in the ancient stadium.
And this is the very poetic description of Paul's death, when he says, As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come.
So I have finished my race, and now the Lord will give me this wreath of glory and praise. So in a way, I have won my victory, and now it's time for you to take over and to do the second step.
I have fought the good fight, and I have finished the race. I have kept the faith.
Now, even if, as many think, Paul hadn't written to Timothy, there must be chunks of genuine reminiscence there, because he refers to Timothy's mother and grandmother, who were called Eunice and Lois, who as Jews then brought him up in the faith to know the Bible and to be quite a devoted sort of person.
We had seen the letter is clearly written by Paul, addressed to Timothy, but nevertheless the majority of scholars at the moment think that it's actually not written by Paul, but again it's written in the name of Paul from a later fan of Paul, from a later perspective. Although at the moment increasingly a number of scholars tries to overcome this kind of scholarly consensus. So I have a good friend in Leipzig who is at the moment writing a commentary on the 3 so-called pastoral epistles, which is the 2 to Timothy and the 1 to Titus. And he is in the meantime convinced that only 1 Timothy is a later addition, but that 2 Timothy and Titus actually are really written by Paul. So that means the discussion is open in a way again.
Deception would be quite the wrong way of looking at it. The ancient world had a completely different view of authorship, copyright, plagiarism, all these things which we understand in a very clear-cut way. There was absolutely nothing wrong with ascribing a manuscript to somebody else. And it would have been very important for a Pauline community to have a sense that it had a Pauline letter that has the authority of Paul. I mean, this is seen as teaching that Paul would have endorsed had he been there to deliver that teaching himself.